The next item on the agenda is a follow-up on the anonymous letter discussed at August 2016 Commission meeting. This is outlined at CMD 17M37, 17M37.A, and 17M37.1. I understand that CNC staff will introduce an expert that you have contacted with, and I understand, Mr. Jamal, you have the floor.
Sir Jamal, for the record, before I start, sir, usually you ask for if the technology is working, so the expert, Dr. Fleming, is online.
Dr. Fleming, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Donc, bon après-midi, Monsieur le Président et membres de la Commission. Pour l'enregistrement, mon nom est Ramz Jamal. Je suis le premier vice-président et chef de la réglementation des opérations au sein de la Commission canadienne de sûreté nucléaire. Je suis aussi le champion de la culture de sûreté. As the safety culture champion, I would like to state the fact that the culture for safety is embedded in law and the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. Our inspectors and designated officers are empowered to stop any operation or make an order to any person with respect to any safety issues. They do perform these duties accordingly, and no safety issue is left unaddressed by our staff. The CNSC has the most competent, world-recognized experts. We do not hesitate, nor we are afraid of continuous improvement. As a matter of fact, in response to the anonymous letter, the CNSC has established the position of Chief Science Officer. Mr. Peter Elder took that position in order to ensure the resolution of technical disagreement within CNSC is addressed. All nuclear safety issues raised by staff are treated seriously and are expected to be resolved in a timely and effective manner. The CNSC has always fostered an environment for raising concerns where staff can feel free to raise nuclear safety concerns without fear of retaliation, intimidation, harassment, or discrimination. The CNSC has numerous processes in place for raising and resolving concerns to include the protection of the confidentiality of the individual raising the issues. This is done completely independent from the line management. CNSC staff opinions are valued and they are encouraged to voice concerns, provide suggestions, and ask questions. At the CNSC, we strive to ensure that differing professional opinions are respected, discussed, and resolved in a timely manner, and that employees are informed of steps taken in response to their concerns. The work completely by staff further strengthens our policies and processes in this area and aims to make further improvements to our safety culture as a regulator. In addition, the work completed by CNSC staff showed that Canada leads the world in the potential application of whole site probabilistic safety assessments, which will be referred to as PSA in the presentation, and that the CNSC is consistent with international practices in the way it applies PSAs in its regulatory framework. Furthermore, the Commission should be made aware of that the CNSC is one of the very few regulators in the world to carry out a safety culture assessment of its own. With this introduction, I will now turn the presentation over to Mr. Raoul Awad and the CNSC team to provide you with a staff presentation as outlined in CMD 17M37.A. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. President and member of the Commission. My name is Raoul Awad. I'm the Director General of Directorate of Regulatory Improvement and Major Project Management. And with us today, Mr. Ross Richardson, the Director of Internal Quality Management Division, Ms. Yolanda Akl, Director of Probabilistic Safety Assessment and Reliability Division, and we have Dr. Victor Snell, Adjunct Professor with the Department of Engineering Physics, McMaster University, and online, as you heard, Dr. Mark Fleming, a Canadian National Professor of Safety Culture at St. Mary's University. We have also some of our specialists, our staff, supporting us. The purpose of today's presentation is to update the Commission on the follow-up action completed by CNSC staff following the August 2016 Commission proceedings on the anonymous letter. We will start by presenting the background and the management action plan, which was prepared to address the follow-up actions from the Commission proceeding on the anonymous letter. Then we'll present the actions completed by CNSC staff. The action pertaining to probabilistic safety assessment will be presented by Dr. Snell and Ms. Ackle, and the action pertaining to raising issue and safety culture will be presented by Mr. Ross Richardson. As a background, in May 2016, the President of the CNSC received an anonymous letter claiming that the Commission had not received information that was important to the 2015 licensing decision for Darlington and Bruce Power Generating Station. The concern expressed in this letter were largely related to probabilistic safety assessment. This allegation we're taking seriously, and an immediate in-depth technical review was undertaken by Mr. Peter Elder, who at the time was the CNSC's senior strategic advisor to the Executive Vice President and Chief Regulatory Operation Officer with 25 years of technical expertise in nuclear safety and reliability. The result of the review were presented to the Commission in August 2016 in CMD 16M46, entitled Technical Review of Probabilistic Safety Issues Raised in Anonymous Letter. The review concluded that the letter allegation were unfounded and that there was no impact on safety. However, the review identified opportunity for improvement. The Commission heard evidence in August 2016 and was satisfied that the issue raised in the anonymous letter were not of safety concern. However, the Commission directed CNSC staff to complete a number of additional actions as documented in the minute of the meeting. To address the follow-up actions from the Commission proceedings on the anonymous letter, CNSC staff prepared a management action plan to track the completion of the work. CNSC staff consolidated these actions into two categories: actions pertaining to PSAs and action pertaining to raising issue and safety culture. We'll speak to the details of each action in the subsequent slides. The action pertaining to PSAs include the relevant actions arising from the direction received from the Commission, the recommendation from Dr. Victor Snell, and the recommendation from Mr. Peter Elder. Now I'll turn the presentation over to Ms. Yolande Ackle.
Thank you, Mr. Awad. Mr. President, Commission members, good afternoon. For the record, my name is Yolande Ackle. I am the Director of the Probabilistic Safety Assessment and Reliability Division. I will be discussing the actions pertaining to PSA. During the Commission proceedings of August 2016, the Commission directed CNSC staff to engage third-party experts in providing information regarding PSA international best practices, whole site PSAs, and where PSAs fall within the regulatory framework. To respond to this request, CNSC staff hired a third-party expert, Dr. Victor Snell. Dr. Snell's report, Probabilistic Safety Assessment and Regulatory Framework, and the disposition to Dr. Snell recommendations are included as part of CMD 17-M37. Dr. Snell has 43 years experience of nuclear safety. He is currently the owner of VGS Solutions, specializing in nuclear safety, education, and licensing. Formerly Director of Safety and Licensing at AECL Can-Do, he managed the industry side of the pre-project regulatory reviews of SES-10, a small heating reactor, Can-Do 3, Can-Do 9, the Advanced Can-Do reactor, and the Enhanced Can-Do 6 reactor. He was Program Director of University Network of Excellence in Nuclear Engineering, UNINI, and has 80 publications on reactor safety and licensing. I will now turn the presentation over to Dr. Snell to present his report. Following his presentation, I will be presenting CNSC staff disposition of Dr. Snell's recommendation and the action completed pertaining to the probabilistic safety assessment.
Thank you, Ms. Sacco. For the record, I'm Victor Snell, soundly introduced back there. I'll be giving a presentation which is as requested by CNSC staff on the safety and regulatory framework of PSA. And I do take a rather broad picture, so if some of you know all this in advance, I apologize for that. But it seemed useful to have it all in one place. So the particular contract was let to me by the CNSC, called the role of probabilistic safety assessment, PSA, in the safety analysis area and in the regulatory framework. And that's the words from the minutes of the CNSC meeting. There's two components which I will deal with separately. One is to document the regulatory role of the PSA. I also know that CNS staff has done that from a very particular Canadian point of view. And then document and provide an independent discussion of the role of a whole site PSA. So I will do those separately. The process I followed was to look at selected current national and international regulatory practices in both deterministic safety analysis, which I'll abbreviate as DSA, and PSA. I used my own experience, analyze the information to draw conclusions and recommendations. I would point out that the report was written for a public audience, so I've not used protected material, and all my references are available to anybody who wishes to pursue them. And I have been working independently of both CNSC staff and the industry, which means that any mistakes are completely my own. I want to start off with a bit of a disclaimer or warning. People often equate safety analysis to safety. They are not the same, whether it's PSA or deterministic safety analysis. The nuclear plant safety depends on many factors. I'll not read them all to you, but things such as the fundamental design characteristics, operating competence, safety culture, design authority, and many other aspects which to some extent are captured in the CNSC's safety control areas. So in red, safety analysis is one means of testing the design and operation of mitigating systems and human actions against postulated accidents. Maybe a somewhat narrower definition than most people think of when they think of safety analysis. So I now cover topic by topic, first being regulatory role of PSA. I'm going to spend a little time on the graph here. It's a little bit design-oriented. We will come to more operations-oriented aspects later on. But if you look down the vertical line, is my mouse shut? Yes, it does. So this is a line from design to operation. One of the fundamental issues in a nuclear power plant when you're designing it and when you operate it is how do you know you've got all the accidents? How do you know you haven't missed anything? And historically this is done by something called deterministic requirements, which came really from a rather limited experience on research reactors, plus people thinking, well, how could things go wrong, more or less heuristically. That sequence on my left-hand side, deterministic requirements, event identification, gave a list of what we now call design basis accidents. And when analyzed deterministically, which I'll cover in a minute, they would confirm that the design of mitigating systems are in fact appropriate. And And in terms of operations, they would set some parameters such as safety system set points, operating limits, various key things for plant operation. And obviously I'm simplifying pretty drastically here, given the time I have, but that's one line of verifying that the mitigating systems are appropriately designed and operated. I'll come back later to the history of PSA, but after TSA was in place, a number of people realized that it was missing certain aspects of safety, and probabilistic approach to safety analysis was developed. This had a different method of identifying potential accidents based on frequency. To some degree, these two boxes overlapped. To some degree, they were different. And we'll get a different set of accidents categorized by frequency. Those are analyzed probabilistically and also gave a set of performance requirements on the safety systems, but the difference being that they went beyond the design basis. So they went into severe accidents as well, and they could test how well the safety systems would respond to severe accidents. In operations, they'd had a very large impact with the basis for things like emergency operating procedures, severe accident management guides, equipment reliability programs, and many, many other things. So that's a one-page picture of a fairly complex topic. So in words, and I've covered most of this, so I won't read it again. Traditional approach was based on experience plus a heuristic review of what could go wrong. Out of that review, one selected a small set of accidents with apparently bounding consequences. We then used pessimistic assumptions to analyze them and use them in the design of mitigating systems, which is why nowadays they're called design-basis accidents. And the underlying philosophy was if a plant could be shown analytically to withstand a set of apparently bounding, stylized accidents using pessimistic assumptions, it could therefore withstand a much larger number of accidents which might actually occur. PSA comes at it from a different point of view. It answers three questions. What can go wrong? How likely is it to happen? And if it happens, what are the consequences? The pioneering study applying PSA to reactors was done in the US. Sometimes you hear it called the Rasmussen study. Official term was the US Reactor Safety Study. It was done in 1975 and used two techniques, which we still use, called fault trees, which determine the frequency of initiating events, and event trees to determine the failure frequency of mitigating systems and containment. I'm not going to explain those now. There's an appendix in my report giving rather trivial examples just to explain what they are. The highlights from the RSS are actually quite interesting. I remember when it came out, we were quite surprised that the most severe design and basis accidents under the deterministic approach were not necessarily the ones that dominated risk. Everybody to that point had felt that large loss of coolant accident was dominated risk, but in fact, the risk was dominated by small loss of coolant. Some event combinations could lead to, and this is a PWR, core melt, at frequencies comparable to single design basis accidents. Core melt sequences, again, PWRs, were more frequent than previously estimated, but had lower consequences, as in fact was evidenced later on by 3 Mile Island. And human error is a major accident contributor. So a little shift in mindset. I've summarized on the next two slides of the strengths and weaknesses of each approach. For design basis accidents, they give, on the strength side, the answers are believed to be pessimistic and real accidents are expected to be less severe. Because of that, you can optimize the effort in safety analysis by choosing bounding accidents rather than all accidents. And because of that, again, you can apply it very early on in the design process before all the design details are complete. On the weakness side, they really aren't useful for risk-informed decisions because they barely contain frequency. They do to some extent, but not very much. And therefore event selection can be inconsistent. one can look at rare events with almost the same scale as one looks at frequent events. They're not much use for accident management procedures because they give a very pessimistic picture of plant behavior, whereas what you want for accident management is a realistic picture of plant behavior, so the operator sees what he expects to see. One has to be a little careful in what conservative means, and it's difficult in that framework, with some exceptions, to identify combined or consequential events. On the other side, PSA. PSA, on its strength side, does provide a measure of comparative risk. It's not risk itself, it's comparative risk. So it allows you a basis for making decisions based on risk. It's very effective likewise in early design. It allows you to evaluate the balance between automatic and operator action in a more fundamental way than deterministic analysis. So one can decide based on PSA whether an action should be automated or should be left to an operator. It has no endpoint, so it gives you a gateway to beyond design basis accidents, which of course have become very prominent in the last couple of decades, including severe accidents. It can be used as a basis for emergency operating procedures and severe accident management guides. As a basis for doing PSA, the bias is to be realistic where possible, not pessimistic. Identifies something called cliff edge effects, where a small change, for example, in frequency, could cause a large change in accident consequences. On the weakness side, it does not predict absolute risk. One of the criticisms of WASH 1400, the RSS, was that it claimed to predict absolute risk and compared the risk of nuclear power to the risk of other energy activities. One has to be really careful doing that because it's difficult to get comparable risk measures which are sufficiently complete to compare absolute risk. It does a very good job of looking at risk of design options on the same plant or the risk of similar plants, relative risk of similar plants. It has trouble handling very rare single events for which there is not a good historical experience. It doesn't handle software errors very well because they tend not to be random. They're either absent or they occur with probability 1 given the right set of circumstances. Some common cause failures can be rather subtle and can be missed. It's difficult to apply it to fully passive structures and systems, although there are techniques for doing that, developing. It's not the tool of choice for looking at safety culture. So although many accidents have as an ingredient lack of safety culture, it's difficult to measure that with a PSA. There are other techniques that have to be used. And traditionally, it's not been used for malevolent acts which tend to be treated deterministically. So PSA is used extensively in operational decision-making, besides design. My bias is design, that's my background, but it is used heavily in operational decision-making. We've heard a little bit about that. It's used to assess proposed design changes. It's used to look at the effect of impairments in safety-related equipment. Is it important? Is it not important? It's used to optimize maintenance, testing, inspection, and it's used to deal with what I believe is called discovery issues, when you get a surprise, an unexpected thing happening at the station or for a research program. So all this leads to a rather obvious conclusion that PSA and DSA strengths and weaknesses are complementary, and of course both should be used in a balanced approach to safety. And certainly reflects my view in that graph that I showed you. PSA in Canada has had a rather long history. The NRX research reactor accident led to a fundamental rethinking of power reactor philosophy, and part of it was to try and get numbers on the frequency of severe accidents to meet safety goals. And the way they do that, to translate that into something which is useful to designers and to operators, was to limit the frequency of process system failures and the demand unavailability of safety systems. And that philosophy is carried on since the accident itself and has always been a fundamental part of can-do. In fact, Douglas Point, if you're a history buff, was licensed on a risk basis, not risk informed, it was actually risk analysis. But it was realized that afterwards that the technology was not adequate for treatment of common cause failures. So it was not pursued after Douglas Point until recently. However, it did give the designer and operator specific tools to measure success, reliability of mitigating systems, frequency of process failures. And that was actually a world first. Nobody else was doing that at the time. Once we got to the licensing of the large can-dos, Pickering, there's a shift away from probabilistic techniques because of the weakness I mentioned, and the licensing philosophy became somewhat more deterministic, but not completely. As you all know, the licensing bases of every plant up to Darlington was initially called Siting Guide, which split accidents into two classes, which were frequency-based. Later, consultative document C6, which was used for Darlington licensing, split them into 5 classes, roughly frequency-based. So there was still a probabilistic component, even though the licensing basis was deterministic. There are a number, the weaknesses in the deterministic approach, which I mentioned earlier on, were recognized by designers back in, I'm trying to remember, I think the late 70s, early 80s. And the designers felt they needed a tool beyond that to help their design. And these at the time were called safety design matrices. If you looked at them today, you'd say that's a limited level 1 PSA. And it was an internal tool. ACL, for whom I worked at the time, set up its own acceptance criteria, and it resulted in many changes to the design. And eventually it became recognized as a useful enough tool that it was adopted by the regulator, who of course then set the regulator acceptance criteria. And I'm not going to go through the whole history, but PSAs are now done for all can-dos. I looked at the regulatory status of PSA in Canada. I think the CNSC report has done a lot more detail in terms of the processes. PSA is not specified as such in the Act, nor in the Class 1 regulations, nor would you expect it to be. They're much too high-level documents to specify a methodology, which gives the CNSC staff and CNSC itself very broad discretion. The way you find the requirements of PSA are in the CNSC Reg Docs and RD series, particularly 3 which I've listed. So I looked through those. The most recent one is Reg Doc 242, which is probabilistic safety analysis. That gives the scope of what one's supposed to do. RD GD 369 talks about what's required to construct a nuclear power plant. PSA is in there, but the wording implies it's optional. It says should instead of shall. However, Reg Doc 252, which covers design, says you shall do it. So my view was that, well, we should clean that up. The CNSC, when the next appropriate revision of RD GD 369 should be made consistent with the 252 and put the shall word in there rather than should, to make them consistent. I looked at non-power reactors. The CNSC does have requirements for PSA for non-power reactors that's required. So I didn't really have any comment on that other than in some cases it was difficult to find a public summary. Power reactors do a very good job of publicly summarizing their PSA. It's easy to find. For non-power reactors, one has to dig. NRU PSA summary has been published, but it's difficult to find something for non-power reactors, although that's referred to. Now, for non-power reactors, one must and will tailor the scope of a PSA to fit the inherent hazard and complexity. Generally speaking, there'd be less scope in a non-power reactor than a power reactor. So I simply, again, recommended for consistency that CNSC should ensure that suitable PSA is performed at the appropriate time for non-power reactors. I believe that's the case. and a public summary made available. I have a comment on safety goals, which in fact has been picked up and dealt with, I think, quite well in the CNSC companion document, of course, which I didn't have at the time. CNSC sets numerical safety goals on individual risk and social risk from a nuclear power plant. This is in common with international practice. They're a little different, but not significantly. That includes frequency limits on core damage, frequency limits on small releases of radioactive material, and frequency limits on large releases of radioactive material. And the numbers are largely consistent with international standards. To show compliance, in my view, effectively requires a PSA. It's pretty difficult to do that without a PSA. One of the issues that I have with a pass-fail criterion is it's a somewhat of an artificial boundary and implies precision in the PSA that doesn't really exist. It implies somehow that acceptable risk changes abruptly as you cross the boundary, and it implies that existing plants are less acceptably safe than new design, for which the criteria are quite stringent. I'm not suggesting changes to these, but there needs to be context setting when these things are presented, and I believe, having looked at the CNSC document that was produced just recently, that document does that. So recommendation 3 has essentially been taken care of, which CNSC explain the meaning of what a safety goal is in a way which acknowledges the inherent uncertainty of both acceptable risk and the means used to calculate it. Some countries use a range of acceptability, some use fixed lines, and those are dealt with in my report. PSA is used heavily in operations, particularly in what in Canada is called a risk-informed approach. Risk-informed is different from risk-based. Risk-based uses the PSA numbers as a decision tool. Risk-informed uses PSA as one input to a decision. And I'm not going to read all these, but these are some of the areas where I understand PSA is used in operations. My industry colleagues can confirm and possibly add to that list, sorry. I think it'd be nice to see more stuff published in the public literature on that. Some of it is. It's, I think, a useful story. My own view is it should be easy to find and publish to show that it's a tool that's being deployed and ends up with useful results. And parenthetically, one of the issues with PSA is one has to be a little careful what one publishes, not just because of proprietary information, because one has to be a little careful about publicizing too widely means of causing accidents. And this is common to PSAs all over the world. I spent some time looking at Canadian approach, which is really what I was asked to do, compared to international practice. One can make this very complex, and one of the risks of summarizing things on a table like this is that you would end up with a number of footnotes that would take the rest of the presentation. So I apologize in advance for oversimplifying in the attempt to put something on one page. I looked at about 7 different areas, how PSA is being used. Are numerical safety goals required? Is it required for pre-project design? Is it required for construction license? Is it required for operating license? Is it required for periodic safety review? Is it used for technical specifications, or Canadian terminology, safe operating envelope? Is it used to risk-inform regulations? And I didn't take every country in the world. I took the big nuclear players, plus some others that I thought were doing innovative work. But it's certainly missing a number of countries that also do PSAs. Again, the risk of oversimplifying, countries seem to fall into 2 groups. One is where PSA is used pretty much across the spectrum and ticks almost all the boxes. In that category, I would place Canada, United Kingdom, certainly, Finland, Argentina. There is some variation as to whether PSA is required in pre-project design. In practice, it's required. For example, in Canada, it's required as part of vendor design review, and almost anyone who's going to introduce a new design to Canada would have a vendor design review. So I'm going to like I say, one could put a lot of footnotes on this. The second category of countries are ones that don't really have PSA embedded in their regulation on licensing, but catch it other ways. So in the US, for example, there are numerical safety goals. If you want to do a design certification, then you're doing a PSA. If you want to do plant refurbishment, you have to do a PSA. If you want to look at severe accident management design alternatives, you've got to pretty much do a PSA. So they catch it other ways, even though it's not formally required for a construction license under 10 CFR 50 or an operating license. Or in the US does not do periodic safety review. So the second category of countries is ones that don't formally require it as part of a construction or operating license, but sort of get it other ways. All countries use it to risk inform their own regulations. I'm not going to read the words, I've just said that on that slide. So I will read, however, the conclusion that from my point of view, Canada is generally consistent with best world practices in the way it uses PSA in regulation. I'll now come to topic 2, which is whole site PSA. Sometimes it's called MUPSA, multi-unit PSA. It's a better acronym, but not quite as accurate. So multi-unit sites pose obvious challenge. To date, with one exception, PSAs are based on single units with some incomplete treatment of multi-unit effects. I'll get to the exception in a minute. And this is particularly an issue in Ontario, where plants share parts of safety systems, such as containment, parts of emergency, in OPG terms, emergency coolant injection, emergency electrical power and water. Those are shared among the units. And if you simply take a single unit PSA number, multiply by the number of units, you can be quite wrong and not know which way you're wrong. You can overestimate risk because some common cause events, such as seismic, are already included in the single unit PSA. You could underestimate risk because it doesn't look explicitly at all multi-unit effects. So the reason a whole site PSA is a preferred term is because when you say multi-unit PSA, it's not clear you're including other sources of radioactive material, such as spent fuel base. Obviously, the accident of Fukushima emphasized the importance of looking at spent fuel base in multi-unit accidents. So there are broader whole site issues. A lot of these came from Fukushima. And again, there's no point in my reading them to you, but I'll select a couple. Unexpected adverse conditions on site, such as radiation and debris, lack of communication, organizational failure. And certainly we saw all 4 of those at the Fukushima accident, where they couldn't actually get to some of the places they needed to get to because debris was blocking the roads. A lack of communication, organizational failure, it wasn't clear who was in charge. They couldn't communicate with people they wanted to communicate. I mean, that's all been very well documented. Human performance, I think, I'm not a human performance expert, there's people behind me who are. But as you know, staff in Fukushima were calling their families and saying they weren't sure they were going to make it home. So these are things which go beyond applying a single unit PSA to multiple units, and the sort of things that a whole site PSA would be expected to catch. There was one MUPSA done in 1983. Seabrook, unfortunately their PSA is not public. However, they had a public summary of it. And the rather interesting thing there is that and they had very limited sharing. Most, there were single units with somewhat limited sharing. I think they shared if I remember correctly, the condenser cooling water intake. And despite that, the frequency of core damage to both units was close to 10% of the frequency of damage to one unit. So it's a synergistic effect that would not have been predicted had you just looked at the single unit PSA multiplied by 2 to get the frequency for single unit failure of either one, not the frequency of both. So if you look at the numbers, the core damage to one reactor for when you have a 2-unit station is about twice the core damage to one reactor when you have a single unit. That's what you'd expect, a little less actually, but the core damage to both reactors was about 10% of the core damage to one reactor for a 2-unit site, which is a bit surprising. This is my take on multi-unit techniques. I'm certainly not an expert on this because it hasn't been done yet, but it would have similar strengths and weaknesses to a single unit PSA. There's no reason, to my mind, it can't be done. There's no fundamental reason you can't do it. As the CNSC staff will indicate, there's a pilot whole site PSA, which has been started by the Canadian nuclear industry for Pickering. The US NRC has started a level 3 whole site PSA. This is done by the regulator. It's a little different. They've not published much on it, but I think when it comes out, it will be a game changer because they are probably putting a lot of resources into it, but they've not really published much in terms of progress reports yet. Others have started in Europe, and the IAEA is really doing it at the stage of information sharing. There are non-PSA techniques of multi-units, which I will barely touch on, and these are deterministic techniques, not probabilistic techniques. These have been implemented post-Fukushima, such as in Canada what we call emergency mitigating equipment, which is putting on site things like portable power generators, portable water pumps, hose reels on wheels, so you can move hoses around bulldozers so you can clear debris, putting them in a protected area which is not likely to be affected by whatever has affected the multi-units. The US has something very similar, which they call flex. There's other approaches you could use, but to my knowledge, not been used. IEA is looking at something called stress tests, which is an analytical approach to see how far can you push the plant before something bad happens. And they use that post-Fukushima. So there are advantages to the whole site PSA, which I guess are pretty obvious at this point. It's a systematic way of looking at vulnerabilities. You can predict health effects reasonably accurately, so it will tell you whether you can access an area or not. It gives, to my mind, this is the biggest thing. It gives you physical insight into accident mechanisms and interdependencies. This increase in knowledge of the station, to my mind, that's the most important outcome of a whole site PSA, not the numbers, not so much the numbers. And therefore you can look at the risk effectiveness of mitigation strategies. How many pumpers do I need? How many bulldozers do I need? Obviously the results are only as good as the data, and so in line with the duality that I talked about earlier on, I believe there'll be a continuing role for deterministic approaches to multi-unit events. They'll be complementary as they were for single units. That's my belief. So, long recommendation, which ends up saying, in principle, whole site PSA is a good thing. We support the pilot project, but my suggestion, which I think is now reflected in the CNSC report, is don't rush to write regulatory requirements beforehand until you see how this thing ends up, what insights you gain, what the numbers actually look like, what the strengths and weaknesses and uncertainties are. And that follows historical approach where PSAs were done actually before people started setting safety goals, because then they could set reasonable safety goals in context to what could actually be achieved. So I think for a pilot study, it's going to be what can we do, what confidence do we have in the numbers, and then at that point it would be a good time for, in my view, for the regulator to sit back and say, how do we bring this into a regulatory framework? This is a somewhat obvious recommendation, but again, what I had access to was published material, This is simply to encourage industry and CNSC to keep the lines of communication open so that there's no surprises when the final MAPSA was presented. Not so that CNSC gives prior approval, but so that there's good communication on a rather pioneering project. I believe this was done as well with the safety design matrices. And again, I noticed in the CNSC document that this, in fact, is taking place. So my conclusion on topic 2, since the conference here a year ago, President Canada still leads the world in potential application of whole-site PSA based on the pilot project of Pickering being performed in the Canadian nuclear industry and assuming it's completed in a timely manner. Other people are also starting, particularly the US. And my overall summary for the 2 topics I was asked to look at, deterministic and probabilistic safety analyses are complementary and equally important, in my view. And Canada is consistent with best practices in the use of PSA in regulation. And second, the application of whole-site PSA to Pickering is a useful extension of PSA and should give valuable insights into the safety of multi-unit sites. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Snell. Yolanda Ackel for the record. In summary, Dr. Snell's report provides a historical review of the development of PSA methodology in Canada and compares the current regulatory practices in Canada to those in selected countries with a mature nuclear industry. The comparison shows that Canada is consistent with international best practices in the way it uses PSA in regulation. The regulatory role of the PSA is well defined in the CNSC regulatory framework. With respect to the whole-site PSA, Dr. Snell concluded that at present, Canada leads the world and recommends that incorporation of whole-site PSA into the regulatory framework to await the results of the Pickering pilot project. He also recommended that debates about the whole-site safety goals to be discussed after the pilot project has been completed. Dr. Snell's report provides general recommendations to CNSC staff, which have been all addressed. These slides summarize Dr. Snell's 6 recommendations and CNSC staff disposition to each. CNSC staff have accepted and addressed all Dr. Snell recommendations and documented CNSC staff disposition of his recommendations in Appendix D of CMD 17-M37. In summary, CNSC staff agree with all of Dr. Snell's recommendations and agree on his position on PSA in the regulatory framework, which is aligned with CNSC's regulatory practice as documented in CNSC staff document Regulatory Role of PSA. However, only 2 recommendations required follow-up. First, update RDGD 367, License Application Guide, License to Construct Nuclear Power Plant, to state that a PSA is a requirement for a license to construct. The document will be then republished as RegDoc 1.1.2 version 2. This document is already in the regulatory framework plan. Second, establish the regulatory requirements for whole-site PSA after the completion of the Pickering whole-site pilot project. This action will be completed after we receive the results of the pilot project scheduled to be submitted in December 2017 and the results of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, and the Nuclear Energy Agency, the NEA, international initiatives on the whole-site PSA, which are both led by the CNSC and are scheduled to be completed by 2019. One of the findings of Mr. Peter Elder in CMD 16-M46 was that the authors of the anonymous letter overstated the importance of the PSA in the regulatory context. Given this finding, Mr. Elder recommended that the regulatory role of the PSA should be clearly documented. To address this recommendation, CNSC staff prepared a report entitled Regulatory Role of Probabilistic Safety Assessment, which was appended to CMD 17-M37 and which clarifies the regulatory role of the PSA and the whole site PSA, how PSA results are compared against safety goals, how the PSA complement the deterministic safety analysis, and what constitutes a major change that would require an update to the PSA model. To ensure a consistent understanding of the regulatory role of the PSA within the CNSC, the report on regulatory role of probabilistic safety assessment was sent out to all operation staff, both technical and regulatory program staff. This report will also be added to the management system documentation under the conduct of technical assessment process. A plain language executive summary report has been posted on the CNSC website in both French and English, and members of the public interested in reading the full technical report can request a copy. CNSC staff conclude that this recommendation has been addressed and that no further action is required. During the August 2016 public proceeding on the anonymous letter, the Commission directed staff to include a full update on the completion status of the PSAs at all licensed nuclear generating stations in future MPP regulatory oversight reports. To address this request, as presented to you this morning, CNSC staff have included a new section 2.2.3 in the 2016 Regulatory Oversight Report for Canadian nuclear power plants. This section provides a completion status of PSA at all licensed nuclear power plants. This new section will be included in all future annual MPP regulatory oversight reports. CNSC staff conclude that this recommendation has been addressed and that no further action is required. One of the findings of Mr. Elder in CMD 16-M46 was that the authors of the anonymous letter were not making a distinction between the scope and the depth of information required for a review to issue a license and the scope and the depth of a compliance review after a license have been issued. Given this finding, Mr. Elder recommended that CNSC management needs to more clearly document the required scope and depth of technical reviews to support licensing. To address this recommendation, CNSC staff have revised the conduct of technical assessment process to include additional guidance in determining the scope and depth of technical reviews to support licensing and compliance in section 1.4.3. The updated process distinguishes the criteria to be used for the purposes of a licensing review from that to be used for a compliance review. The revised process will be rolled out to the technical and regulatory program staff this fall. This concludes the section on PSA, and I will now turn the presentation over to Mr. Ross Richardson, Director of the Internal Quality Management Division.
Thank you, Ms. Ackle. Mr. President and members of the Commission, my name is Ross Richardson, and I'm the Director of the Internal Quality Management Division at the CNSC. I will be presenting the actions pertaining to raising issues and safety culture arising from Peter Elder's recommendations and the direction received from the Commission. As stated earlier, we also have Dr. Mark Fleming, Canadian National Professor of Safety Culture at St. Mary's University, online to answer any questions you may have. One of the findings of Mr. Elder's review was that the anonymous letter alleged a lack of trust in the CNSC's internal whistleblowing process, despite the CNSC's efforts to provide multiple channels for raising and addressing differences of opinion. Given this allegation, Mr. Elder recommended that CNSC management should reinforce with staff all of the processes available for raising issues, including the role of the Office of Audit and Ethics. To address this recommendation, CNSC staff completed a number of actions. The CNSC President and Chief Executive Officer reiterated the importance of the ability to raise issues without fear of reprisal in an all-staff email in July 2016. In addition to raising issues with line management, the email highlighted the existing differences of professional opinion process and the CNSC internal disclosure program managed by the Office of Audit and Ethics as avenues to raise issues. Also, the President reinforced the concept of skip-level meetings, where staff can talk freely and openly to the senior manager to whom their supervisor reports without feeling intimidated by their supervisor's presence. These meetings also provide a good opportunity for senior managers to connect with employees with whom they might not have an opportunity to interact with on a regular basis. CNSC management also reminded CNSC staff of the previously published recourse brochure entitled Here to Help, Important Services for CNSC Staff. This document outlines the many services available to CNSC staff to help resolve issues or concerns. Continuing from the previous slide, CNSC staff conducted an all-staff survey in October 2016 on raising issues, and in December 2016, CNSC conducted a management retreat on how to improve in this area. As outlined in the recourse brochure, there are a number of mechanisms in place for CNSC staff to raise issues or concerns. These include informal mechanisms, such as raising issues at staff meetings and with your direct supervisor, to more formal mechanisms, such as raising the issue or concern to the Office of Audit and Ethics, or using the differences of professional opinion process. In addition, staff can use the informal conflict management system or report the issue to their union steward or labor relations as necessary. The new open door policy, non-concurrence process, and revised differences of professional opinion process will be discussed further in a subsequent slide. In addition to reinforcing with staff all of the available mechanisms to raise issues, the Commission directed staff to investigate why current mechanisms of raising issues are underutilized and whether more effective mechanisms could be implemented. In October 2016, CNSC staff conducted a pulse survey on raising issues to explore this area. The pulse survey revealed that the majority of staff felt that their immediate supervisor or manager provides a safe space to raise issues or concerns that are important to them. Respondents were also well aware of the tools and resources at their disposal, and the majority of respondents are likely to use the open door policy to raise issues or concerns. With regard to the issue of why staff members do not use all mechanisms at their disposal, staff comments suggest that most would prefer to highlight issues, resolve conflicts, or address differences of opinion informally. The findings of the Pulse survey on raising issues were also used to inform the work of the Scientific Integrity Working Group, which was established in August 2015 as a joint project between the CNSC and the Nuclear Regulatory, or NUREG group, to explore, amongst other things, the efficiency and effectiveness of the differences of professional opinion, or DOPO process. With us today is Ms. Jennifer Campbell, Union Representative and Co-Chair of the Scientific Integrity Working Group. The work of the Scientific and Integrity Working Group led to the development of the following policies and processes as shown on this slide. A new policy on science in a regulatory environment, which established the new Chief Science Officer, who is the CNSC Vice President of the Technical Support Branch. The Chief Science Officer is accountable for science-informed recommendations in support of regulatory recommendations to the Commission and for ensuring adequate expertise and support are available. A new open door policy to formalize the atmosphere of open and free communication and to welcome questions and address work-related issues and concerns. A new non-concurrence process to provide a clear pathway for staff to seek resolution of their differences of professional opinion regarding scientific and regulatory decision-making when reasonable attempts through existing work processes have failed, as well as a revised differences of professional opinion process and a revised publishing and posting of technical papers process. Each of these policies and processes have been included as an appendix to the CMD. This figure illustrates the escalation approach CNSC staff can use to raise issues and concerns. It starts with informal staff-to-staff discussions, then staff-to-supervisor discussions, followed by supervisor-to-supervisor discussions. If the issue or concern still cannot be resolved through informal discussions, then more formal means can be used, including the application of the open door policy, non-concurrence process, or differences of professional opinion process. The DOPO process establishes the new Chief Science Officer as responsible for the appointment of a review panel to resolve the difference of professional opinion. And at any time, staff may use the internal disclosure program shown on the right of this figure, where staff can raise issues or concerns in confidence and independent from line management influence. And during the public proceedings in August 2016, the Commission instructed staff to implement a mechanism to formally assess CNSC staff's safety culture as soon as practicable. To address this direction, CNSC staff decided to conduct an organization-wide regulatory safety culture self-assessment under the advice and guidance of an independent third-party expert, Dr. Mark Fleming, Professor of Safety Culture at St. Mary's University. To conduct the assessment, CNSC staff utilized International Atomic Energy Agency guidance to develop the methodology and used the Nuclear Energy Agency's publication entitled The Safety Culture of an Effective Nuclear Regulatory Body as the framework to assess the CNSC's regulatory safety culture. The team also benefited from the work that Dr. Mark Fleming is conducting in conjunction with the IAEA on the development of a safety culture assessment questionnaire for regulatory bodies. The assessment team designed a multi-method approach to gather data using a combination of qualitative and quantitative data sourced from document reviews, including past employee surveys and safety culture town hall meetings, safety culture focus groups, a new safety culture perception survey informed by the work of Dr. Fleming, as well as the upcoming 2017 Public Service Employee Survey to be released in August 2017. The assessment activities have been grouped into 4 phases as shown on this slide, and the assessment team is currently in phase 2, the conduct phase. Once the assessment team has completed the conduct phase, the team will complete its analysis of the data, draft a final report, including an action plan, and communicate the findings. CNSC staff will then implement the action plan, document lessons learned, and conduct follow-up activities as necessary. We will report back to the Commission once the final report has been completed and the findings have been communicated to staff. And we are targeting to report back to the Commission on the results of the assessment by June 2018. So in summary, CNSC staff have confirmed by Dr. Snell that CNSC regulatory requirements on PSA are consistent with international best practices, clarified the regulatory role of the PSA, including the whole site PSA, provided additional guidance to staff on the scope and depth of technical reviews to support licensing, included the completion status of PSAs in the regulatory oversight report for nuclear power plants, strengthened the CNSC's mechanisms for raising issues, and established a formal mechanism to assess the CNSC's safety culture. CNSC staff conclude that all follow-up actions arising from the August 2016 Commission proceedings on the anonymous letter have been addressed. CNSC staff will report back to the Commission on the results of the regulatory safety culture assessment once the final report is complete and the results have been communicated to staff. Thank you. We are now available to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you.